Hello, everyone. My name is Elamin Abdul Mahmoud, and I'm the online producer for The Agenda with Steve Paikin. And today I happen to have the pleasure of the man himself, Steve Paikin. Hello, Steve. How are you? So we're going to be taking some questions today, Steve, just about Ontario politics and about the election and what's going on. So I'm going to start off with a question from Bill, and these questions will keep rolling in from Twitter and from the live chat that we're hosting. So expect many really good questions. The first one is: have any of the parties considered introducing a universal prescription and dental plan as an incentive to companies by reducing their benefit costs?
Not that I know of. I know, for example, the NDP had its platform launch yesterday, and I'm just going to rifle through it very quickly because I think what they, if memory serves, suggested was introducing a form of dental care. There it is here. We will ensure that more low-income children have access to dental care. With our financial commitment, coverage will be expanded to 100,000 low-income children. I know the Liberals over the last few years have also made improvements or enhancements to their dental care coverage for lower income people, but I don't think universal dental care.
Right. Now, the second question that we've got here is from Alex, which is: could you please comment on just what strings are attached, if any, to tax breaks and cuts or subsidies?
Sure. If I understand them, the benefit being offered by the Progressive Conservative Party has the fewest strings attached. In other words, they would cut the corporate income tax rate from 11.5%, where it is today, to 8%, and you wouldn't have to do anything to be eligible for that other than to be a company that pays corporate income tax in Ontario.
Right.
The other parties, and similarly, I would say the Green Party also has a tax break that, again, doesn't depend on anything other than you being a company that is eligible to receive it, and you are eligible by virtue of your size. So at the moment in Ontario, companies pay what's called an employer health tax, and that money is supposed to come in and go towards health care. Of course, it just goes into general revenue and they spend it on anything, but essentially it's supposed to be health care. The moment small businesses pay that tax, or everybody pays the tax, but if you're a really small business with a payroll of less than $450,000 a year, you don't pay that tax at all. The Greens are saying they would like to increase the threshold at which you start to pay that employer health tax to $900,000. So you could be a little bigger small business and avoid paying the employer health tax under the Green proposal.
Right.
The Liberals and the New Democrats have slightly different proposals. The New Democrats have a tax credit, which kicks in only if you hire people. So you don't, unlike the Conservative tax cut, you don't get it for doing nothing, essentially. You only get it if you hire somebody. And it's a sliding scale up to, I think, potentially represents, I think, $10,000 of someone's salary. And the Liberals have got this $2.5 billion job subsidy plan whereby, again, if you agree to set up a business or hire people for a piece of that fund. So if I understand it, that's what the four main parties have on offer so far.
Right. Now, question 3 is from Sharon. Now, Sharon says provincial government downloaded the governance of cooperative housing to the municipalities. Now, there are many problems in that sector. Both municipalities and the provinces insist that it's the other guy's job. Now, Sharon is wondering whether any of the parties have put forward ideas to address this, and if so, what those ideas are.
Okay, a little history here. I think this goes back almost 20 years to when the Mike Harris government was in power in the late 1990s, when they brought in a report called Who Does What? And essentially that was designed to kind of rearrange, as the title of the program suggests, who did what. So there were various things like education that was uploaded to the provincial government. The provincial government uploaded $5 billion worth of education funding that used to be on the property tax bill. In exchange, it downloaded to municipalities and so on. And with the benefit of a couple of decades of hindsight now, there are many people who believe that these arrangements no longer work. I know that I can't speak to social housing specifically, but I know that in general, the Liberals have said they are prepared to consider additional uploading, for example, ambulance services, court services, from what municipalities now are required to pay for. They say they would pay for it. The Conservatives, of course, trying to balance the budget 2 years in 2 years, a year ahead of the other two mainline parties, have said they would not do any of that. There would be no more uploading until the budget is balanced. So I think that's the distinction so far.
Now, question 4 is from Barry. I share this question as well. I'm very curious about this. With the probability of another minority government, what are the chances we'll be just doing this again in 2 years?
Well, the reality is, if you get a minority government, you are allowed to be polls every 2 years. That's the length of a minority government. Usually, you can get one or two budgets passed, and then things become either so toxic, or the polls change, or one party in the legislature thinks its fortunes have improved, and therefore it wants another election. I think one big exception to this was in 1985, when we had a Conservative government elected with 52 seats, but the Liberals were right behind with 48 seats, and the NDP with 25 held the balance of power. Funnily enough, though, the Liberals, who came second, actually got more votes. They got 38% of the total votes, the Tories only 37%. So Frank Miller, who was then the Premier, winning the most number of seats, had the right to meet the House and form a government. He did, but on the very first opportunity to render a judgment on whether he could keep the confidence of the House, the Liberals and the New Democrats combined forces and voted down the government. Election second, that vote pledged just a few weeks later, so we obviously weren't going to go back to the polls after just a few weeks, particularly since the Liberals and New Democrats had signed an accord, an agreement, agreeing on certain items that they would pass. And so the Liberals were asked by the Lieutenant Governor to form a government, and they did. Lasted for 2 years, had another election, they won a majority, lasted for 3 years.
Right.
And then we went back to the polls, and on we go.
But I can always count on you to give me a little bit of a history lesson, so thanks for that.
You can always count on me, Elamine, to give way too long an answer to what was basically a simple question. But in essence, I think what the question is getting at is, is there an avenue here where Tim Hudak successfully runs a minority progressive conservative government? And most people seem to think that option really isn't on, because he doesn't have, if he only has a minority of the seats, he doesn't probably have a partner in which to govern. And at that point, if he loses the confidence, it's very interesting point of view as to who Lieutenant Governor calls on to form a government. If it's very shortly after Hudak takes power, probably the second place party would have a chance to form a government. If it took place, for example, 6 months or a year after Hudak took power, hypothetically speaking, my hunch is we're back to the polls for another election.
I know a few people at work who have been kind of talking about the likelihood that the NDP and the Liberals might join forces if Hudak was in fact to win a minority government. So this has kind of been going on in terms of conversation for the last little bit.
Sure.
Now, question 5 is from Mark. He says, "I'm confused about the Green Energy Act. What does it do, and why do the PC want to scrap it?"
Okay, the Green Energy Act was passed by the Dalton McGuinty Liberal government, so not Kathleen Wynne's Liberal government, but Dalton McGuinty's. And it's a very wide-reaching act, which, trust me, is too complicated to explain in great detail here. Suffice to say, one of the things, and this is the part that is so controversial as far as the Conservatives are concerned, one of the things it does is that it offers incentives to people to encourage them to use renewable power and to create renewable energy. So, for example, that farmer in rural Ontario who wants to put $50,000 down or $100,000 down to put up solar panels on the roof of his farmhouse, or to allow his land to be used for solar panels, and then take the power that creates and sell it back to the hydro grid so that everybody can use that power. The Ontario government, under the Green Energy Act, pays that farmer, signs a contract with that farmer, and pays that farmer a surplus above the market rate for that power in order to encourage the creation of that renewable energy. Now, it was a very controversial plan when it first came in, because the amount of extra that the government of Ontario was prepared to pay in order to create that power was so far above and beyond what market prices were for the power if it were created by nuclear or by gas or by hydroelectric, that people said, wait a second, this is ridiculous. We're paying way too much to create this electricity, which we don't need to create. The Liberals' position was, we may have to subsidize the creation of a nascent industry at first, but eventually, once more people do it, and there is greater supply, the prices will come down, and that in fact has happened. Now, that doesn't mean that conservatives like it anymore. They still look at it as a distortion of the market. That power is created, but it still is created at a rate that is higher than market rates, which I think today are something like 4, 5, 6 cents a kilowatt hour. And as a result, the conservatives say, if they win, they won't cancel contracts. Any contracts currently signed, they will honor. Any contracts that are in negotiation or in pipeline, negotiations, they won't take, obviously, any more applications for any more what's called FIT contracts, feed-in tariff contracts. And that would be the end of it. So that's the gist. That is the controversial part of the Green Energy Act that people refer to.
Now we're going to go on to question 6, which is, will ads by public sector unions critical of Tim Hudak's plan to eliminate 100,000 civil service jobs, will they be effective, or have voters already made up their mind on this one way or the other?
Well, the question suggests I can tell the future, and I can't. So I don't know if they will be effective. What I can say is that they have been effective in the past. I think the questioner refers to a group called the Working Families Coalition, I think now just called Working Families. And this is a coalition put together by backroom people in the Liberal Party, which include a lot of the private sector unions. Pat Dillon is from the building union, is widely reputed to be one of the guys who's very involved with working families. And yeah, they will spend $2 million trying to, well, if you don't like what they're doing, demonize Tim Hudak. If you do like what they're doing, point out the contrast between what Hudak would do and what the Liberals would do. The ads, funnily enough, never actually say vote Liberal, which is why they somehow can skirt the Election Expenses Act. Because they don't say, Tim Hudak's terrible, he'd lay off 100,000 people, do we really want him in charge, therefore vote Liberal, it doesn't count as expenses on the Liberals' behalf, and therefore it's a sort of a clever way to skirt around the Election Expenses Act, and they have been found to be legal. I think the Conservatives took the Working Families Coalition to court, and because the ads don't say vote Liberal or vote NDP or whatever, they've been found to be legal. But to be sure, the Conservatives had a heck of a time responding to these ads last time, and I think the Tories had a 15-point lead in the summer of 2011 before the election campaign started. By the time the campaign started, Tim Hudak had lost 10 points off that lead already, and then once the rest of the campaign began and the Conservatives made some mistakes, there went the lead altogether. So that's the history of that.
The next question is from someone named Brian, and Brian wants to know if you really think the gas plants are driving the discussion on this campaign, because it doesn't seem so to Brian.
Whether they're driving the discussion, I would say no, and I take the party leaders at their word on this. Tim Hudak says this is a single-issue election campaign, and the single issue is which party has the best plan to create jobs. Obviously, he thinks the PCs do, and their million jobs plan, and he's laid out all of the planks in that platform. The other party leaders have not been so explicit, I don't think, as to say this is a one-issue campaign, and the one issue is who can create jobs. Certainly yesterday at her platform launch at Hart House at the University of Toronto, Andrea Horvath played hard, metaphor that way. She played very hard the card that this is a government you can't trust anymore, the Liberals, that they have squandered the public's money, that they have lost the moral authority to govern. She actually accused the Liberals of illegally covering up their malfeasance on the gas plant situation. I think that's the first time she's accused them of that. So offered an opportunity to say this was an election about jobs. She didn't say that. She said it was actually an election about trust, and that she thought the Liberals had lost the trust of the people, and that the Democrats, with a platform relatively similar, not the same, but with many similarities to the Liberals. So if you're a progressive voter, she says, vote NDP, don't vote Liberal. They've lost the moral authority to govern. She hasn't. So
last night's program was also accompanied with a little live chat, and during the live chat, so the last night's program about energy and an energy policy and which party has the best energy approach. And I was hosting the live chat yesterday evening, and it's people have moved on past gas plants. At least that's the way that they expressed it. Because the program started off talking about gas plants, but everyone was like, "This is from 3 years ago. Let's move on." Are you getting that sense too?
Well, obviously, I hear both. I certainly hear from conservative stalwarts. We can't let the Liberals get away with this. Their decisions on the gas plants were made for craven political reasons to save seats in the west end of Toronto and Mississauga, and they need to be punished for doing that. So I do hear that. Yes, I do. And I've spoken to Liberal candidates who say they pick it up at the door. I was talking to Brad Dupin yesterday, who's the Liberal Minister for Training Colleges and Universities. He's seeking re-election in Scarborough Centre, and he admits, yes, he does hear the gas plant issue come up at the door. Having said that, I also hear the other thing, which is that, okay, this story is already 3 years old. This story is more complicated than it seems, because we have to remember the Conservatives and New Democrats also promised to cancel that plant. They didn't promise to put it in the first place, but they also promised to cancel that Mississauga plant. So if they had won that election, they would have been in the same position the Liberals were,
Right.
having negotiated a settlement with a company whose contract they broke, and therefore we'd be furious at the Conservatives for, blowing $1 billion or whatever. So these are the distinctions. The fact is, it's a murky story, because it's very hard to see how one party has, all of truth and justice on its side but did nothing wrong, and another party, is all evil and has got nothing positive to say about it. We have to remember, the Liberals also said in yesterday's program that they have successfully sited and built, I think it was 21 or 22 gas plants.
22, yeah.
22 since they've been in power, and only 2 of the 22 have been controversial, and all of the rest have been done without controversy and are working fine. So if you look at that track record, they say, I asked yesterday in the program, Elamine, of the Minister of Energy who was on, was, does all of the good that you think you have done on the energy file, shut down coal-fired generating stations, increase green energy production in the province, cited 20 of 22 gas plants successfully, does all of that mitigate against the disaster that the 2 plants in Oakville and Mississauga were? And obviously it's up to the voters to decide, on balance, which carries the day.
Right. Question 8 is from McDavid, and this is the question that came up in the chat that we had last week. And the question is, how do you feel about the fact that Tim Hudak has suggested TVO funding will be cut? Is it hard to converse with him in an unbiased way when he could eliminate your job?
I'm going to challenge the premise of the question a little bit. I don't ever recall on the campaign trail, or before that for that matter, ever hearing Tim Hudak explicitly say to cut TVO in the election. I stand to be corrected, but I don't ever recall him having said it. In fact, when he was on the program several months ago, I put the question to him that on the Monday he mentioned he wanted to privatize the LCBO. On the Tuesday he said he wanted to privatize the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Commission. On the Wednesday he said he wanted to open up for tender beyond the sort of closed unionized shop that now had the right to bid on, for example, government services and school boards. And I said to him, I thought for sure on Thursday there was an announcement coming about TVO. And his answer to me at that time was, stay tuned. Well, I have stayed tuned, and I haven't heard anything since then.
Right.
So, I don't think the premise of the question is right, and therefore I don't really have an answer for it.
Fair enough. Question 9 is from a guest to our chat, and the question is, there are 17 registered political parties, officially registered political parties of Ontario that are not represented at Queen's Park. So far, I've only seen one such party in party, and so you plan on to feature any of the others on the agenda. And the answer is, actually, I can take that. We will be featuring a little bit about each one of the parties on our website. That's coming, I think, either today or Monday, where we'll be kind of talking about all of the other parties that don't necessarily have the profile that the big 4 parties have.
Yeah, let me just add one thing to that, Elamine, and that was, we decided at the agenda to add a Green Party representative to all of our political discussions when we have the 3 main parties on that do have seats in the legislature, because we felt that the Greens met a threshold that other parties that did not have seats had yet to meet. For example, the Greens do run candidates in all 107 ridings across the province of Ontario. None of the other parties, the Libertarians, the Family Coalition Party, the Marxist-Leninists, the Communist Party, etc., they don't. So that's a threshold that the Greens have met. In addition, in 2007, they did poll 8% of the total votes, which seemed like more than that the other parties traditionally capture. So again, we thought they had met a threshold there. Number three, the Greens have been running candidates in elections in Ontario since 1985. The Green Party is an internationally recognized significant force in other parties. They do have seats in the Parliament of Canada. They do have a seat in the legislature in British Columbia. So it just felt like we ought to treat them differently from the other parties that do not have seats in the Ontario legislature, which is why we include them in our discussions. We had in years past had the leaders of the other parties without seats in the legislature come in for one-on-one interviews with me that we put up on the website, and some of them availed themselves of that opportunity and some of them did not. It's always, because of our studio availability and tight scheduling around here, it's always hard to get those, to find time to do those interviews. So I'm glad to hear that we're doing something on the website at the very least. I wish we could do more, but
now, the next question that we've got here is a question from Dina. She says, Steve, what do you think about the styles of platforms? Are people looking for too much detail, or are parties prepared to provide minute details? NDP have been really criticized. How can parties get the expertise and help they need to make sense of these ideas?
Well, I think the parties actually have a good amount of expertise in-house to put forward enough detail on what they want to do. Again, only because it just came out yesterday. The NDP, I don't know if you can see this, but I mean, that's a pretty extensive list of all of the things that they would commit to. It's very specific about how they would bring more revenue into the Treasury, for example, by raising the corporate income tax rate by 1% from 11.5 to 12.5. They've got all sorts of things here on where they'd find savings in government, hundreds of millions of dollars, and then a list of all the new commitments they're prepared to make to spend that additional money and still balance the budget by 2017-18. Now, they're experts who feel comfortable making these general outlines as to how additional money would come in and how they would spend it. The Conservatives have done the same thing. They have said, if we cut 100,000 jobs and save the money that way, and some through attrition and some through contracting out those services to the private sector, etc., and if we don't spend on this and if we don't spend on that, and if we cut taxes, which in their view would enhance economic activity and therefore bring more money into the Treasury, they've got their plan for how that would work. I think the Liberals are coming out with their specific document in the next few days. So there's no shortage of plans out there. I think it's fair to say that all of these plans, to a certain extent, are as much fiction as they are fact, only insofar as they don't take into account what happens if, we get a flood, or if we have SARS, or if we have a massive electricity blackout, or who knows what. We had a little more than 10 years ago. So these kinds of disasters can always send your budgeting people back to the drawing board, and they should be taken for what they are intended to be, which is a relatively specific, thought-through outline of the hopes and plans of the party. But as with any general who goes into battle, the battle plan usually is rendered obsolete the second you hit the battlefield.
Right.
We have to expect for that possibility here as well.
Now, question 11 is from Jennifer. The question is, Hi Steve, I'm a long-time NDP voter, but for the past while I've been really disappointed in their policies. I really believe it's important to have a strong voice from the left, but Andrea Horwath seems to be totally abandoning us. What happened, and what's the strategy here? Because nothing about it seems to make sense to me.
Well, I can tell you what the strategy is. The strategy is Andrea Horwath pulled her caucus together one day and said, if you all want to continue to come third, be the so-called conscience of the legislature and just sound sanctimonious but not get any votes, then let's just keep doing what we've been doing. And in her view, that meant appealing to a sort of by Ontario political standards, a far left of the political spectrum, where there just aren't that many votes, but where, in fairness, you can have an impact on what the other parties do by raising awareness. And I can think, in particular, during the McGuinty years, of the minimum wage, which the Liberals did not want to increase, but which a small but hardy band of New Democrats in the legislature pestered the Liberals on, and pestered them and shamed them and embarrassed them to raise the minimum wage. And eventually it was becoming a political headache for the Liberals, and they did. And that's the traditional role that New Democrats have played in the Ontario legislature, which is to sort of shame the governing party, whichever it is, into doing things that they and their supporters would like. Andrea Horwath's taken a different approach. She has said, we're going to move more to the middle. We are going to de-emphasize a lot of the so-called social justice and poverty planks in a platform that we used to put forward. This NDP platform is unlike any I've ever seen before. She's certainly been good to her word. It talks as much about tax breaks for small business, tax credits for job creators, as it does about doing things. In fact, I don't think the word poverty is mentioned. I mean, I stand to be corrected, but I don't think the word poverty is mentioned in the NDP plan. Wow. So it's definitely Horwath's attempt to make her party seem less scary to small business, to make the party seem more palatable to a larger chunk of the electorate. And I don't know what, I mean, the polls are all saying such different things nowadays, but one poll has the NDP at 28%. And if that's correct, that's significantly higher than what they usually poll in between elections.
Right.
So we'll see. I mean, she may the last laugh, but she may ultimately show that if she can come back with more than 21 MPPs, which is what she went into this election with, that her strategy was right. Now, whether it's right for Ontario, whether it's right for poverty, whether it's right for making a huge chunk of the NDP traditional base happy, that's another question. In terms of electoral success, if she comes back with more than 21 seats, she could claim that her approach was better.
Now, you had a blog post earlier this week where you talked about how this particular, I guess, turn on Andrea Horwath's part came entirely from the leader's office. It didn't come from a party-wide kind of consultation or vote. Do you think that's going to have an impact on, I guess, the numbers that they actually get on election day?
Again, Elamine, I never like to predict the future because I don't know. But what I can say is that Tony Blair tried this in the United Kingdom, and he won 3 consecutive majority governments. I'm not predicting that for the NDP, but I'm saying if you're behind you, you can have electoral success. Bob Rae tried to do it. Bob Rae in 1990 won the Ontario election as an NDP premier. He tried to drag his party kicking and screaming more into the middle. They wouldn't come. And 5 years later, he was back in 3rd place. Andrea Horwath, the one controversial aspect of what she's trying to do is that I think that's right, the way I put it in the blog post. This is very much a leader-driven, as opposed to party-base-driven or caucus-driven effort. And if you lead, but nobody follows, that's a problem. She is leading. We'll know on the 12th of June how many people followed.
Right. The question 12 is from Walter. Walter has heard accusations that Tim Hudak has been unclear about his proposed public sector job cuts. He's wondering how clear what Hudak has said about cuts been to you. Has it been pretty clear?
No. I think the one thing Mr. Hudak has clearly said is that he thinks the size of the broader public sector, and by that he means everybody who works for municipalities, schools, hospitals, universities, the people whose paycheck is signed by the government of Ontario, and that's about 1.1 million people in the province of Ontario. He says he'd like to cut that number of people by 100,000 jobs. Now he puts it into this kind of a context. He said under the Liberals, the size of the broader public sector has increased 300,000 over the last decade. He wants to roll that back by 100,000 to what he says are 2009 staffing levels.
Right.
When put in that kind of a context, and he says a lot of that can be done through attrition and contracting out those services that the government provides to the private sector. Put in that kind of a context, Mr. Hudak believes that it's not a scary pledge. Obviously, the other two parties are saying, here's what you'll have to cut if you want to do that. I think the opposition parties do have a leg to stand on this one, insofar as Mr. Hudak has said he would protect healthcare and the police. In other words, any reduction in jobs would not come from those two sectors. That is a huge chunk of the broader public service.
Right.
If they are protected and no job diminutions will come from that, that means, according to the math of some I've seen, 1 out of every 6 jobs in the rest of the broader public sector would disappear. Full marks to Mr. Hudak for being specific about that pledge. Politically speaking, it may be a bridge too far for some people, because if you're talking about making 1 out of every 6 non-police, non-healthcare jobs in the broader public service disappear, you are talking about teachers, you are talking about early childhood education people, you are probably talking about somebody nearly every family limits. And by that I mean, you know, if it's not the husband, it's the wife. If it's not the wife, it's the wife's sister. If it's not the husband, it's the husband's cousin. I mean, pretty much every family, broadly spoken, has somebody working in the broader public sector. And some people, obviously, and some conservatives have confessed to me that this aspect of the Tories' million jobs plan needed to be better rolled out, because they are acknowledging that it is causing some concern. So that's probably enough on that.
Well, the Globe and Mail actually ran a little bit of, I guess, what they called back of the envelope math, and they said that actually what will be left is 2 out of 3 jobs would be somewhat education related, and that seems to be a very high number. I don't know how plausible that is, but I think if he's going to go through with it, I think it's going to be something that everybody kind of knows about for sure.
Yeah, well, keep in mind, Tim Hudak is running a campaign last time in 2011, which was his rookie campaign. A lot of the items in his platform were focus group tested to death, and they were in the platform not necessarily because he believed them, but because they tested well with certain audiences. He's not doing that this time, and you can tell he's a much better campaigner. He is campaigning on issues that he in his gut and head believes in, and the fact of the matter is, you are a better campaigner if you're campaigning on what you truly believe in. If you're campaigning on stuff that your people have told you, this tests well, just run with this, it's certainly harder to look sincere. So his campaign has been better this time, and I think he's got to a point in his own political career. Remember, he's been there for almost 20 years at Queen's Park. First got elected at the age of, I think, 27. He's at the point in his political career where he's saying, you know what, this is what I believe. I'm going to throw the chips where they may. If people want it, here it is. If they don't want it, I'm okay with that, and I'll go on and do something else. So it's all 3 parties are taking quite gambles in the way that they are courting the voters.
So I'm going to move on to question number 13 here, Steve, and that's from Zubair. And Zubair says, what are your thoughts on how important transportation funding plans will be in the mind of voters this election?
Well, again, I'm going by hunch here because there's millions of voters in the province of Ontario, and believe it or not, I haven't talked to them all. I've talked to a lot of them, but I haven't talked to them all.
Right.
This is clearly going to be a big issue in places like the Greater Toronto Area, where both the NDP and the Liberals have $29 billion 10-year transit and transportation upgrade plans. It's a controversial plan for the Progressive Conservatives because, of course, they have said that they would cancel some of the plans that are on the books right now, and I think that includes the Finch line in the north end of Toronto, the Mississauga line, I think maybe the Kitchener-Waterloo line as well. I think that includes the electrification of GO Transit. Their goal reach 1 million jobs by balancing the budget in 2 years, not 3, and as a result, those projects will have to be put on hold. Now, I don't know how voters are going to think about those things. It may well be that some voters will say, you know what, he's right, we got to balance the budget, we are carrying too much debt, our deficit is too big, if we have to delay these programs by a year, so be it, and they will give him credit for that. Others will say, we've been waiting 10 years for this light rail transit, we want it, this is a bad idea to cancel it right now after we've done all the architecture, all the engineering, started to dig holes and so on, so in which case he'll lose their votes. And again, we'll find out on the 12th of June.
Right. Now, of course, we're doing a show on transit this coming Monday. So I just tell the bear to tune into that.
Good point.
Now we're going to go to question number 14 from Mike. Mike asks, why do the main parties refuse to tackle beer in convenience stores? To me, it's a huge political win. Why do...
This is another one of those, was it Mike? Is that the questioner's name?
Mike, yeah.
Mike, this is another one of those stories that goes back, in this case, almost 30 years. I covered the 1985 election campaign when Premier David Peterson, he was then opposition leader Peterson, promised to pick up the monopoly of the beer stores and the LCBO and put beer and wine in the corner stores. And it was a great popular, I kid you not, I think he got as many votes for that policy idea as for anything he put forward. It was a fresh, 30 years ago, this was a fresh new idea, which really caught the public's imagination. And, you know, I'm old enough to remember, some of the people who are on this online chat right now won't be old enough to remember, but I remember the days when you went into the LCBO and there were no bottles on shelves. We were not trusted enough to be in that close proximity to the booze. You had to go in there, you had to fill out a piece of paper from pictures on a wall of what kind of alcohol you wanted. Somebody behind the counter, and they went into the back room and got the product for you, because God forbid all of this alcohol should be seen in public, because who knows what would happen.
That's my first time hearing of this.
Well, that's the way it used to be in Ontario, in the beer stores too. And things have obviously changed. We've liberalized sales of alcohol and beer in the meantime. But this promise of really opening it up and putting beer and wine in the corner stores was first promised 29 years ago. Once the Liberals got into power, they realized it was going to be much more difficult to actually do than what sounded, and so they walked away from it. And every government since then has as well. And you saw Tim Hudak this time, who promised to privatize the LCBO and open up liquor sales. Even he has said, I still believe in that, but I'm backburnering that promise. The one thing the Liberals have done on this is that they have promised to create 10 pilot projects around Ontario, which would allow wine sales, I think, and maybe some wine in supermarkets, but the larger supermarkets and, of course, the corner stores, some of them are very upset about this because they feel that puts them at a competitive disadvantage. Anyway, there's something about the monopoly of the beer stores, and remember, these are 3 foreign-owned brewers who have basically a monopoly on beer sales in the province today, basically. There's something about the logistics of actually opening that up that is very problematic, and it starts with distribution and pickup of empties and all of that. And governments that have looked at it have ultimately just decided too hot to handle, not going near it.
Fair enough. I think question 15, which just came in from Dina, it's probably my favorite question of this chat so far. And the question is, honestly, what is a gas plant?
Okay, good. I love this question because it's true. Sometimes we talk about these scandals over and over and over again, and because it's been around as a story for so long, so good. I like this question, Dina, and let me give this a whirl. When people talk about the gas plants, they talk about the fact that there is a policy by Ontario Power Generation, which is the largest, it used to be part of Ontario Hydro, and it's the largest electricity generation company in the province. You own it. It's owned by the people of Ontario. Their philosophy has been build sources of power as close to the populations that those sources of power are designed to serve. Because when you transmit electricity over transmission lines, over long distances, there's always a bleeding off, and you lose some. So it's much more efficient to build whatever power sources you need close to the populations that they're designed to serve. And so, the Ontario Power Authority, which is another group, boy, there's an alphabet soup of electricity organizations in Ontario, decided that in order to serve Mississauga residents, they needed to site a new gas plant, a gas-fired electricity generation plant in Mississauga. When they made that decision, they didn't particularly consult the local neighborhoods all that effectively. There actually weren't that many neighborhoods around there when they started the process. But of course, Mississauga is booming, and as a result, as the process took years and years to go along, there became neighborhoods, schools, I think a hospital as well, very close to the site, the proposed site for the Mississauga gas plant. There were protests by these residential groups saying, you can't put the gas plant here. It might have made sense years ago when you started the process. It doesn't make sense anymore. The McGuinty government basically ignored those protests and continued with its contract with a private company. In the dying days of the 2011 election campaign, Walton McGuinty held a news conference in which he said, I'm now canceling the contract. I've heard what the people have said. I'm now canceling the contract. We won't build the plant there. It's dead. We'll move it somewhere else. Mississauga residents were thrilled. Charles Sousa, the finance minister today, whose seat is in Mississauga South, was thrilled. He'd been lobbying for that for years. A lot of other liberals who depended on the cancellation of that plant because it was a political turkey around their necks were thrilled. When we found out after the election was over what the cost of canceling that contract was going to be, $1 billion, suddenly everybody wasn't so thrilled. What happened instead was they decided to re-site that plant. I think the Oakville one, which they also canceled for the same reasons, got built in Sarnia. The other one, Napanee, they just added to what's happening in Napanee to Mississauga. There will be bleed off. It won't be as efficient, etc., etc. But a political headache for the McGuinty government went away temporarily, because of course, subsequent to that, it became a huge political mess. Canceling the plant to save those seats, it was obviously a political decision. Mr. McGuinty has confessed that he didn't handle it well. He regrets it. He never apologized for it, but he did regret how badly he handled the issue. And of course, then he retired, and now it's Kathleen Wynne's problem to deal with.
Right. That was a very succinct and very scientific, but also political kind of history of the gas plant story. So thanks for that.
That's what I'm here for, Elamine.
We're going to move on to question number 16 from Charles, and the question is, do any of the Ontario leaders intend on doing something about social assistance improvements?
I'm not sure about the word improvement, and the reason I hedge on this is because I know that, again, a little Francis Lankin and former StatsCan head Munir Sheikh were tasked by the government of Ontario to do a big review of social assistance in the province. And one of the things they recommended was the merging of two programs, one called Ontario Works, which is essentially welfare, and another called ODSP, Ontario Disability Support Program, which if you are a disabled Ontarian or you live with a disability, you get compensation for that, a monthly payment. These are not, by any stretch, overly generous payments that are enough to live on, but it's something. That panel recommended a merging of those two programs in an effort, in their view, to make them more efficient and more responsive to the community, and in their view, better. The disability community rose up and said, we don't like this idea, we'll get shortchanged, and so the Liberal government didn't move ahead with it. The Greens are, they agree with Munir and Sheikh and Francis Lankin that it's the right thing to do. If you're talking about traditional, for example, 3, 4, 5% improvements to welfare payments, that's not on. From what I think I remember in the Liberal budget that was defeated, that didn't pass, there might be a 1 or 2% increase in social assistance payments, I think. That's all I can remember. But nothing more significant than that. And there are other social assistance payments, for example, the Ontario Child Benefit. The Liberals did have some relatively ambitious plans on that to increase it, and to not only to increase it this year, but to also index to inflation future increases. And of course, there were increased compensation for early childhood education workers and personal support workers that were also in the budget that failed. NDP, interestingly enough, did not support the budget, but they have included those in their budget. They do support them, even though they didn't support the budget. So that's some of what's out there on the horizon. The PCs, to the best of my knowledge, don't have anything in terms of specifically enhancing social assistance. Of course, their position has always been the best social assistance program is a good job, and they think their plan will create 1 million jobs.
Now, we've been going for about 45 minutes, so this will be our last question. It's a loaded question. It comes to us from Shema, and she's wondering if the question is, I'm wondering if you know which poll Ipsos Reid or Forum Research is accurate with regards to who's leading this election. Good heavens.
That's just a wonderful question, and I've been on Twitter myself in the last couple of days trying to figure it out because, of course, the Ipsos poll that came out yesterday had the Tories up by 4. The Forum poll that came out the day before had the Liberals up by 8 or 9.
Right.
The
Big gap.
Ipsos and Abacus polls that came out the day before had the Liberals and Tories each behind at 28 or 29. They all can't be right. So I don't really understand why they're all so dramatically differently. There may be, I think the obvious answer is they have different methodology. What the differences are, I'm not 100% sure. From what I understand, Ipsos polls likely/determined to vote voters, whereas the others are merely a gauge of public opinion. They aren't necessarily an indication of who's going to vote, which why the Ipsos poll might favor the Conservatives more, because the conventional wisdom is Conservatives are more determined to get rid of this government
Right.
other voters are, and therefore their vote would be more recognized in an Ipsos poll. A Forum poll, conversely, could just be a snapshot of public opinion, regardless of whether the people intend to vote or not, in which it might stand in that poll. And similarly with the Ipsos poll, I think the NDP showed relatively well in that one as well. And of course, Conservative and NDP voters would be likelier to vote or more motivated to vote because they want to get rid of the government.
Right.
So I think that's the explanation for why they're all so dramatically different. I must confess, I can't recall a time in Canadian history than the past year where polling left me more confused. Not only do the polls all say different things, but I think as we saw in the, certainly in the Alberta election of a couple of years ago, or was it a year and a half, whatever, well, not too long, but the one Alison Redford won, going into that weekend, all the polling showed that the Wild Rose Alliance was poised to win a majority government, and then 2 days later, there's Alison Redford and the Progressive Conservatives winning a majority government.
Right.
I felt very confusing. One thing about polling, Elamine, I guess I'll say this in conclusion, is that polls usually are a very scientifically accurate snapshot of what people were thinking 4 days ago. They are not in any way, an omen of what's going to happen 3 weeks from now. We've got a lot of elections still to go. We have campaign ads which have only just started yesterday. We have a leaders debate still to come. We have some intense campaigning. They are really, we're in this kind of phony war part of the election campaign so far. It's going to really ramp up. You got to remember, last time in 2011, half the people didn't vote. That may happen again. Half the people who will vote this time will only now that the ads are happening and the debate is coming, start to engage. So all of the polls we've seen so far, I wouldn't pay a nickel for them. And by that, I don't mean they're not accurate. I just mean they're accurate 4 days ago. They're not accurate with what's going to happen on June the 12th. They can't tell you anything about what's going to happen on June the 12th. Campaigns matter. We got a lot of campaigns still to go.
Well, thanks so much for that answer, Steve. And I want to thank all of the viewers who sent in their questions and the people who have been tuning into this chat. Do you have anything else to add for today?
Just I want to thank the viewers as well. Those were great questions, and by all means, either on Twitter or send me an email and let me know if you think the answers are adequate, or am I going on too long? I'm certainly anxious to get feedback because we would really like to do more of these, and I would want my answers to be as responsive to the questions as possible.
Sure. Well, thanks so much, and goodbye, everyone.